Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and today we are very excited to have with us a special guest. Lou Blaustein is the founder and CEO of Eco Athletes, and we're very excited to have him share his story with us and talk about the great work that they're doing from that perspective. So, Lou, welcome to the show.
Hey, Roy, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the chat.
We're so excited that you could join us. I know there's amazing work going on around the world, and you'll tell us more about Eco Athletes, about the Green Sports Blog. But before we dive into those areas, I want to jump back to when Lou was a little kid, when you were young and growing up, how you got excited about sports and what drew your passion.
So I grew up in Fairfield, Connecticut, which is Connecticut, as you know, is a divided state between sports loyalties, Boston and New York. But where I grew up was definitely more New York oriented. And so I became an odd combination of Yankees and Jets fans. Most people are Yankees Giants or Mets Jets, but I got influenced by Joe Namath and Mickey Mantle. That gives away my age. And then a huge Knicks fan and college basketball fan. And I was a sports nut from as long as I could remember. I also knew that I was not a really good athlete. And so I was not going to make my living playing sports. And I thought I would try to be a sportscaster. And I tried that when I was at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And that's also a hard way to make a living as well. But total sports nut from the day as far back as I can remember.
So when you were young, then what sports were your passion? What drew you out of the woodwork?
I mean, for me, it was baseball was my first love, baseball, football, and then basketball over time became my favorite sport. But first was the Yankees and the Jets, especially when Namath got the Jets to that incredible Super Bowl III win over the Colts, and that has thus consigned me to 50 years of hell, 50 plus years of being a Jets fan. But the Yankees was a better bet, and and then I also got to enjoy the great glory years of the Knicks.
So obviously, being in a New York environment, you have a wealth of sports opportunities and sports teams to follow and participate. So as you went through school, tell us how that evolved and what drew you into the direction of being able to work in sports.
Well, so I knew that and I kind of alluded to it a little bit ago, I knew that I wanted to work in sports. I knew I was not a good athlete. So when I went to Rutgers, I went on the student station, WRSU-FM, a plug for them, and was fortunate enough to announce Rutgers football and basketball during my time there. And it was a great experience. And in fact, I'm friendly with guys I did games with 40 years ago, still to this day. And so I tried to make it in professional radio after college, but it's a really hard way to make a living, kind of like trying to be an actor. Either you work in small markets and make absolutely no money, or you try and make your way up to the top, or you get just really lucky. And then you can have a tremendous life. So I did that for a couple of years. I could not make it. And so then I pivoted, went and got my MBA at NYU and thought, okay, this is going to be my way into the sports business. And so I had a marketing degree at NYU, but the jobs that I was able to get coming out of there were not in sports. It took me quite a while. But while I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, which really didn't float my boat, I was constantly networking to try and get into the sports business. And finally, after many years, I got a job with a company called Pro Sports Publications, or PSP, which your listeners may not recognize that name, but they are kind of like the playbill of sports. So if you go to a Knicks game, or if you go to a Minnesota Vikings game or the University of Colorado football and you buy the game program, that was us. And I was selling advertising and creating marketing programs for our advertisers and promotions. And it was great because, you know, we got to go to the World Series and the World Cup and the NBA Finals and get to talk sports and get paid to do it. It wasn't on the air, but it was pretty much the next best thing. So I did that. And then I went over to Sports Illustrated and Sports Illustrated for Kids, and continued along in the same ad sales, marketing, promotions world.
Well, that gives you a lot of insight into many aspects. I know that one of the challenges for people getting into the sports world is which doors are going to be open, and people that can go in and do what you did and sell and find advertisers. There's always a spot for that, no matter how the market evolves, right? What you're selling might be different today with digital media and podcasts and video and social media and everything else, but that core relationship and that core ability is often one of the best starting points for people going into careers in sports, where they have the opportunity to sell, whether it's tickets or advertising, sponsorship. So
100%.
you had a great foundation. What was your favorite part of working at SI and SI for Kids?
I mean, for especially with SI Kids, I felt like I really enjoyed the mission of it, which was to get kids to read. And especially, I mean, it was more boys than girls, and there weren't really many magazines targeted to boys. And getting boys to read, you know, is not easy. And so, and this is, you know, kind of at the dawn of the internet age. So it's going back maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago when I was there. And so SI Kids Digital was just kind of coming along. But, you know, and the kids who read it, our readers were so into it. And I could imagine that was me, you know, 25 years earlier or whatever, you know, 30 years before, except there was no such thing as SI Kids when I was a kid. And so it really, I really got a kick out of that. I felt like we were doing a good thing.
Yeah, I think that there's been a big shift, right? I think in the time you're talking about, it was targeted to boys because boys didn't read, and that was a great resource. But on the flip side, it was probably fairly exclusionary for girls because it didn't cater to that marketplace at that time when it initially launched.
Yeah, it was just starting to, I mean, I was there 6 years, and I would say in the 6 years, the coverage of women's sports increased significantly at SI Kids. I don't know that the readership, I think the percentage of girls that read it also came up, but I don't know if it was that rapid. And I left there in 2005, so I have not followed it very closely since then.
Yeah, there's been a lot of evolution. Obviously, we've seen a lot of issues relating to how to get more women and girls involved in sports. And so, what did you do after you left SI?
Well, so that's where I got into environment, sustainability, and climate. So how that came about was, so while I was at SI, I was there for 6 years, like I said, and it was in Midtown Manhattan. And the thing that really changed it for me, the aha moment, and it sounds cliche, but it was 9/11. So I was working at SI Kids on that day, and I'm from the area, as I said earlier, and lived my whole life there, and was living in Manhattan at the time. And I did not, fortunately for me, I did not know anybody in the buildings, but that was this moment where, kind of like in my parents' generation, it felt like it was the Pearl Harbor of our generation. But after Pearl Harbor, a lot of people literally the next day signed up to join the service. And I felt like I had to do something after 9/11, and I just didn't know what to do. I mean, some of my friends who were made of different stuff than they would go after work in the evening down to ground zero, and they would volunteer helping for the Red Cross, helping the people who were working on the pit there. I didn't do that. So then about 10 months, 12 months later, there was an article in the New York Times, a column by Tom Friedman, who's still writing for them today. And the headline was "Green is the New Red, White, and Blue." And in that column, Tom Friedman, who is, you know, this multiple Pulitzer Prize winning columnist who writes about macro things, geopolitics, big trends, he was making the case that we in the United States, at that time, 4% of the world's population, which is still roughly the case, but 25% of the world's energy use were, because this was before the fracking boom and the domestic production boom, we were importing a tremendous amount of our transportation related energy needs from bad actors like the Saudis. And the Saudis, remember, 17 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. And we were sending this oil money to the royal family. The royal family really enjoyed being alive and the royal family, so they would divert some of that oil revenue to their Wahhabi extremists on their right, basically to buy them off. And then the Wahhabis would use some of that money to train people to fly planes into buildings. It was this perfect circle. And so he said we were fueling the wars on terrorism that we were fighting, regardless of what you thought of those wars, by our insanely profligate energy use. And so it was like the compact fluorescent light bulb, because there were no LEDs then, went off above my head. And I went out and bought a hybrid car. I was a very early adapter that way. I changed out all my light bulbs. I went, you know, now like 92% vegetarian. But, you know, making these so-called virtuous personal decisions is one thing, but that's not really going to change things. So I started networking in the green space, and that's when I became schooled and learned about climate change. And then those two forces, you know, energy security and climate change, these macro forces kind of told me I need to get into the green world. I need to work in this world if I'm going to make a difference. So long story short, I was networking like crazy, realized there were no jobs for me in it, you know, because I'm a marketing, sales, biz dev guy, communications guy. And green jobs, what, you know, they're like putting solar panels on a roof, and you don't want me anywhere near a roof, let me tell you. So 2005, I left Sports Illustrated for Kids, and I decided to become a consultant using the things that I was good at: communications, marketing, and sales, but instead of in the magazine world and sports, in green. And that's what I've been doing since then. And then I made the connection between sports and green about 5 years later in 2010, 2011, which I can share that story if you like.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is you talked about that evolution, right? That watershed moment from 9/11, and really, as you said, I love the headline, "Green is the new red, white, and blue." That you talked about that article and looking at what do we need to do as a country to really improve where things stand, because we've really historically done a very poor job, right, in terms of sustainability and in terms of the environment.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think for me, it started out with this idea of energy security and making sure that we were not sending our oil money and our energy money to bad actors, and so that we needed to use less and become more efficient. But then as I learned about climate change, I realized it's not a US problem. Climate change is the biggest global challenge that humanity faces, which also means it's the biggest opportunity. The solutions to the things that will solve climate change provide the biggest opportunity for humanity. And so now the question is, do we have the will to make the changes fast enough? And I say we need sports to get into a leadership role on climate change specifically. And so that's where I've evolved even from 2005 to now.
So as you look at that evolution, that's a roughly 15-year window in terms of what you have been involved. What do you think has changed the most in that time frame?
Um, I think that what's changed the most, and it's been recent, is the overall acceptance of climate change as being real and human caused by, now a strong majority of Americans, and that we realize that I'm making big generalities. There are obviously many people who are not going to agree with what I'm saying, but more people do. Or that I'm looking outside here and it's snowing, and oh, it's cold out. That means climate change isn't real, right? No, people get that weather can be, there can be cold weather and still be climate change. Those two are not opposed, and people are getting this. So especially the younger generations, so Gen Z, millennials, and whatever the generation after Gen Z is called, they're not going to be asking the questions like we were, and which is, oh, is climate change real? Oh, no, they're going to be asking the questions, how do we deal with this now? Because this is what they're asking. And so that's been a big change. If you look at the 2016 or the 2012 or the 2008 presidential elections here in the US and the debates, I don't believe there was a question about climate change, or maybe there was one, all told, in those three election cycles. In 2020, not only was it climate change, there were questions about environmental justice, and more than one question about climate change. And you can just see it's much more on the radar. So I think that's the biggest change.
Yeah, I think what you expressed about people being kind of reluctant to accept where it's coming from, that's something that certainly received a lot more attention and notoriety over the last 15 years. And the the changes have come probably more slowly, right? The recognition is fairly easier for people to accept and acknowledge. The actual changes in what's going on are much more difficult to change those that conduct and those habits. So we're sitting here in 2021 recording this. What do you see as the light at the end of the tunnel for the next, call it 3-year window on where those efforts are going to focus and what kind of results we might be able to see?
Really good question. I mean, you know, I believe that, right now we are in this kind of 3 to 5 year window where we really need to start getting to serious decarbonization. We can't, and 2020 was an anomaly. CO2 in the atmosphere was basically flat or even decreased a bit because of COVID. People weren't traveling and economic activity went down. And so the carbon emissions associated with that also went down, but that we're not going to be living that way. So we need a three-pronged approach that needs to start now. And it's already started at the corporate level. I mean, you're seeing it with General Motors committing to only be making electric vehicles by, I believe it's 2035, which is amazing because they were the ones who killed the electric car. There was a famous documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car. And GM even sided with the Trump administration against the California miles per gallon, the high miles per gallon standards of California. In basically a year or less, they flipped to now we're only going to be making electric vehicles. And that's just one example. Corporations are getting it. But the biggest thing now is having governmental action at the federal level and beyond. I mean, it can't only be the US, but the US needs to lead. We were absent for 4 years. And now I think that we have a chance to make the policy inroads that need to be made from green infrastructure, investment in clean energy, retraining workers who get displaced by the switch from fossil energy to clean, which has to be part of it. And I actually think that carbon pricing, putting a price on carbon, is going to be the way that'll be very efficient at raising funds to help get us to accelerate us on our cleaner, greener path. So corporations are already getting it. Government needs to help lead, and then the consumer also has to play a role, but they also have to be given the choice of greener options.
Yeah, I think the choice of greener options is something that gets a lot of debate, because until the market gets more efficient, right, a lot of the choice for greener options means that you're paying a premium, you're not getting a better value. So if you go out, I remember looking at hybrid cars and the difference in the cost of the hybrid car on the purchase price, right, you weren't going to offset that purchase price differential based on the amount of gas that you would save, unless you kept it for either an inordinately long amount of time or did an enormous number of miles in a shorter window. And so that differential has come down now, so it's getting closer to being more efficient, but it's still the consumer still has to say, I'm going to be willing to take money out of my pocket to pay for a greener perspective.
Right, and that's why a carbon price would help even further, right? Because if you put a price on carbon, then then either electric vehicles and operating them, or hybrid vehicles and operating them, are going to become cheaper relative to fossil vehicles, and so that would just accelerate the process. And there are proposals and bills out there now that are structured in ways that because there'll be higher prices due to the carbon fee, that would be skewed to the people who are in the, let's say, lower 2/3 of the income scale, would actually receive more in a dividend. It's called a carbon fee and dividend, not to get too much into the weeds on this, but they would basically, the fee would be applied at the where the energy is extracted, and then instead of the money going to the treasury, it would come back to you and me in the form of a monthly direct deposit, and you would receive more in dividend than you spend in higher prices, because the lower 2/3 of the income scale in the main are much lower carbon users. They don't have gazillion square foot houses, and they don't have 5 cars, and they're not traveling all over the world. And so if people get used to the idea, hey, this policy is helping me make money, that actually, I think, is going to be something that could be really sticky and popular, I should say.
Yeah, that incentive, that economic incentive, obviously, as we've all probably heard about the carbon credits for factories and other corporations that are polluting, in a sense, that are paying to offset those pollution dollars for somebody else who's creating those efficiencies, and that creates the marketplace for exchanging those credits. And if that expands to the consumer level, where there really is a justification for, we'll pick on athletes, right? Do you need the 15-bedroom, 19-bathroom, 42,000 square feet of house, right? Does that really what you need to have to support and pay and light and heat and cool and everything else, compared to everything else? So I think it's going to be an interesting element to look at how that progresses.
And we're in a right now, like, we are right at an inflection point. I mean, it's a really interesting time to have this conversation, because even with the cost of fossil energy being relatively low, EVs and hybrids are becoming, that price differential is actually, really close to going away, because the cost of solar energy, the cost of batteries for EVs, that would, which is what will produce the electricity to power the car, are like in a kind of free fall. And so now, it's actually that you're going to see massive growth in a lot of these clean technologies in the next 3 years. And if there are policies that accelerate that, that's only a good thing.
Yeah, it's going to be a big change, but I want to back up to the work that you're doing. So
Sure.
you got out of the corporate world and jumped out of SI and had this watershed moment, and then you're looking at it and saying, okay, now I've really got to do something for the world. So tell us about your vision when you started that, and how you came up with designing the concepts for what you're working on now in terms of eco athletes and the green sports blog.
Sure. So, when I started, back in 2005, I felt like this is a time where, companies are going to need to tell their green stories, are going to need to sell their greener technologies, and they're going to need to, if they may have a greener technology, they may need to just create their green story. So that's what I was doing, and have been doing for companies and nonprofits since 2005. But around 2010, 2011, I started to think, what if there was a marriage of green and sports? That would be so cool. It'd be a marriage of my two passions. And I just started poking around, the Google machine, and I found that there was something called the Green Sports Alliance, which is a trade group of stadiums and teams that were, trying to find better practices in terms of things like recycling and energy efficient lighting. And this started in 2011. So I started following them, and I thought, I'd like to work in that. So I started Green Sports Blog in 2013, so almost 8 years ago. And I'll be straight up. I thought this would be a great way for me to meet anybody who's everybody in that green sports intersection, this kind of niche within a niche within a niche that was starting to flourish, and that maybe I could help them, that my consulting value proposition could help them. And it kind of worked out that way. About 75-80% of my consulting work since then has been in the green sports arena, pun intended. But then the blog kind of has found an audience, which I never really had done it before, so I had no idea if it would. But now we get about 12,000 page views per month, which is a few zeros removed from what, say, ESPN.com gets. But we are, like I said, a niche within a niche, and we cover all manner of sports greening, from the stadiums to the facilities to zero waste games to what's going on in policy, etc. And so I've been doing that. And so say from 2013, over the next 5 years or so, I would start thinking, why is the sports world greening? Because it's a really, except for the people who are in it, it's kind of this secret that the sports world has done a tremendous amount of greening. And going back well before I started writing the blog, maybe down to 2003 with the Eagles, Philadelphia Eagles, starting with the Go Green initiative. Why are they doing that? What problems are they trying to solve? And I couldn't come up with a really aha answer. Sometimes it might be they're trying to become more profitable, because if you have solar panels on the roof of a stadium, once you overcome the initial cost, you recoup it, your ROI is going to be positive, or energy efficient lighting or what have you. So that's a fine motive. But maybe they were trying to be a good corporate citizen or a community citizen, or trying to check a box. But it just felt like very amorphous. And then I thought, what do I think they should be solving for? And I said to myself, it's got to be climate change. This is the biggest problem, as I said before. And the sports world would use the word sustainability and green, but they wouldn't talk about climate change. And I would press them in my blog. And this is like 2015, 2016, 2017. It's gotten better more recently. But I was like, and this really angered me. And I said, no, this can't be. We can't be scared of this. And I also interviewed a lot of athletes for my blog. And I realized, and a lot of athletes who are doing really cool environmentally related, off-field initiatives, like working in plastic ocean waste or e-waste recycling or hurricane relief. And I'd ask them, what about climate change? Oh, no, I don't go there. And I thought, no, we need athletes. Athletes are the people who are, that's who they change culture. And we need athletes to lead on climate as they have on civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, issues of war and peace, all manner of social issues, but not yet on climate. And so that's where eco athletes came up, because I felt like there's a reason why they get involved in these other issues, but not climate. There are three main obstacles to athletes talking about climate change. And we need to chip away at that boulder of obstacle so that they can feel comfortable to talk about it. And that's what Eco Athletes is about. Our mission is to inspire and coach athletes to lead climate action. That's a mission statement. But put another way, just you and me talking colloquially, we want to find and deploy the Muhammad Ali's, the Billie Jean Kings, the Megan Rapinos, the Colin Kaepernicks of climate change. We don't have time not to do that. So that's how Eco Athletes came about. We launched it in April of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic.
So that's a new initiative going into, as you said, into a difficult time. You've done a lot of work to lead up to that, and we all know what 2020 was for so many organizations. So year one has been very different probably than what you imagined in terms of access and availability to connect with people. But tell us about what you see going forward now on Eco Athletes as you look at the connection and the value to going ahead over the next 3 years.
Actually, I think we are also at the right time, just like I think that the world is at an inflection point on this, both in terms of awareness, interest in, and the technological advances that are happening. I think athletes are much more engaged on a number of issues than they were 20 years ago. So I think athlete activism is experiencing an uptick, and it was not slowed by COVID at all. And so I think Eco Athletes is coming at the right time. So what we are doing is we do two main things. One is we have a network of what we call Eco Athletes Champions, which are now 33 strong, and they are athletes from all over the world. We have a Major League Baseball pitcher, Brent Suter. We have a retired NFL offensive lineman, Gary Gilliam. We have Olympians from all over the world. We have Mary Kane, the track star. Let's see, I believe we have 19 women, 14 men, 12 sports. And what they do is they are our mouthpiece. They are pushing our social media out to their fans, and also our hashtag, which we are working to get to trend at some point this year, hashtag climate comeback. And so hopefully your listeners will be seeing that throughout this year. And then what we do is we give workshops, climate communications workshops virtually to athletes. And we get funding from foundations and or sports teams and or governing bodies and brands as well. To any entity that deals with athletes either as endorsers or has them play for them, as i.e. they're a team, that has also made the statement, climate change is important. We need to turn away from the carbon cliff we're headed for. And eco athletes can make the case that, a dollar invested in us, which basically goes to training athletes to speak on climate change, is going to be a dollar well spent. Because what's really interesting is climate scientists are jealous of athletes, because athletes have the following that climate scientists do not. And we have a climate scientist on our advisory board, Dr. Michael Mann, and he's like, we need to get athletes out there to talk about climate change. And the climate scientist and climate communicator, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who's the best I've ever heard, and she's a supporter of ours, she says the most important thing you can do to have an impact on climate is not recycling, or it's not eating local or eating more plant-based, all of which are important, very important, but the most important thing you can do is talk about it. And if athletes talk about it with their massive followings, then that is going to accelerate demand for climate action from their stakeholders. And so that's the sweet spot where Eco Athletes is looking to make a big difference going forward. Yeah.
We know athletes have an enormous power in terms of drawing media attention and coverage on social media on addressing all of these issues. So would love to see what we can do as a network to help you build up that base of, as you call them, the eco athlete champions, and what's involved for them there. Because I agree. I think on every issue that you look at, the athlete's voice receives a much stronger amplification over the course of the world, over the course of the country, than what you or I might get, or somebody who's a scientist or an expert in any of these areas is going to get on their own. And so I think it's incumbent on us to look at and identify strategies where we can get more of those voices out there through things like this podcast, through other initiatives that we have and that a lot of organizations in our network have. So would love to have further discussion about that, but I want you to tell our audience how they can best reach you and find out more about Eco Athletes and the Green Sports Blog.
Sure. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity. So Eco Athletes, you can find us at ecoathletes.org. And we have a free newsletter that you can sign up for on the homepage. And then Green Sports Blog is greensportsblog.com. And you can subscribe to that as well, also for free. Such a deal. And then you'll be all caught up on what's happening in the green sports world through Green Sports Blog. And you will be part of the Eco Athletes movement through ecoathletes.org.
Well, Lou, you're doing amazing work. I want to commend you for everything you've put together in a short amount of time. We launched that just a year ago, so I know you've done a great job building up to that, and it wasn't just a year of activity, because you've been doing this for quite some time with the Green Sports Blog and all of the other work in that space. So before I let you go, I want to take a moment to put you on the spot. We're going to use our sports philanthropy superpowers, and we're going to wave our magic wand, and we're going to appoint you as a commissioner, but you get to choose the sport. So tell us what sport that would be.
Well, it's so funny that you're doing that. The sport would be the NFL. And the reason it's funny to me is that a while back, I did a column I wrote a column in Green Sports Blog, an op-ed, in which I imagined that I had taken over as commissioner of the NFL for one day, just for one day, and unpaid, by the way, not taking any of Roger Goodell's $40 million a year income, and just to get their climate policy right. And so that was the column, and now you're asking me about it, which is fantastic.
So in that one day, so let's have you dive into that a little bit more and tell us what that consisted of.
Okay, will do. So, I mean, the NFL, obviously, your listeners know, is by far the most popular sport in the United States. And so its platform is huge, but they have not led on climate. And so I'm imagining that they would. So, what would that look like? Well, we did it like this. First down, get to net zero emissions for all 32 teams. And if they expand between now and net zero by 2040, which is 10 years ahead of the Paris Climate Agreement pace. Because you know what? The NFL does everything big. So they should not just say, okay, we're going to go at the Paris pace. No, we're going to go ahead of the Paris pace. And in fact, so all of their, so they will work to reduce their emissions as much as possible, and then whatever, through efficiency, renewable energy, energy storage, et cetera, and then any other emissions that they can't offset will can't eliminate will be offset, and there'll be an independent third party that will referee that, if you will. Second down, transport. We're going to spike transportation related emissions. That's because transportation is the biggest source of a club's emissions. And you know what? The NFL has profited, and the clubs have profited tremendously from the auto and aviation industries over the decades through sponsorships and advertising. So on second down on that score, all stadiums will be outfitted with 2,000 EV charging stations by 2026. Every car owned by the league or the clubs will be an EV by 2026, because electric trucks and vans are adopting at a slower pace. We'll give them to 2030 on that. And then we're going to work with our league partner, Amazon, to launch an innovation fund, very public, very high profile, that will provide funding to incubate low and zero emission aviation startups, because we travel by air, and if we want to continue traveling by air, and we're going to have to come up with zero carbon or low carbon aviation. Third down is environmental injustice, because the effects of climate change fall the most harshly on the people who are least able to deal with them, and those are the poor, people of color, other marginalized groups. And so we are going to contribute a significant amount of money to, along with our partners, we're talking 10 million annually to with Nike, actually, to something that we're calling the Just Do It by 2030 Environmental Justice Fund for grassroots programs in each of the markets. And then finally, fourth down is reaching and engaging the fans. And that's, you know what? When was the last time you saw a climate-themed PSA on an NFL broadcast? You never have. Well, that's going to change since I've been commissioner. We're going to have climate-themed PSAs every game, at least two, and there will be more outreach to the fans and also encouragement to the fans to adopt environmentally friendly behavior, climate-friendly behavior. So that's what I would do in one day.
That's a pretty hectic agenda. You may need a few more than 24 hours to get all of that accomplished, just knowing the landscape on Park Avenue there. But Lou, I want to congratulate you. I want to congratulate you on the great work. What we'll do is we'll put up a link to that article on the page. So as people are listening to this and visiting the episode of your podcast, they'll be able to just see right there and have a link to that op-ed that you're talking about, and more information about both the Green Sports Blog, Eco Athletes, all of those types of initiatives. Very important work. We look forward to continuing to collaborate with you as you expand those options and finding ways to help you recruit more people for your champions program. So Lou, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Roy. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for the Sports Philanthropy podcast. This is your host, Roy Kessel, signing off. Please remember, live generously.